The bustling suburban neighborhood was alive with activity as the late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the streets. Children's laughter echoed from nearby yards, and neighbors exchanged polite smiles while tending to their gardens. This was a community that prided itself on appearances: pristine lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of order. But beneath the surface lay subtle tensions, whispers of prejudice that had long gone unchecked. At the edge of the neighborhood stood a modest house. Its garden wasn't as manicured as the others, but it exuded a sense of warmth and resilience. Inside, Olivia Carter, a heavily pregnant black woman, carefully folded baby clothes and placed them into a small bag. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and tinged with a quiet strength. Despite her visibly tired state, her resolve was unshaken. Olivia paused by the window, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She gazed out at the street, her expression calm but reflective. The neighborhood had never truly accepted her. Whispers of, "Why is she living here?" and "She doesn't belong," often found their way back to her. But Olivia had learned to endure. Her quiet strength masked the storm she was ready to unleash if pushed too far. Across the street, a patrol car rolled to a stop, its flashing lights catching the attention of passers-by. Officer Mark Harris stepped out, his posture stiff with authority. Known for his abrasive demeanor and thinly veiled biases, Harris had a reputation for targeting those he deemed out of place. Today, his sights were set on Olivia. Trailing behind him was his partner, Officer Daniels. Younger and less experienced, Daniels often followed Harris's lead, unsure of how to navigate his partner's aggressive behavior. As Harris adjusted his belt and strode toward Olivia's house, Daniels hesitated, glancing uneasily at the neighborhood onlookers. Harris pounded on the door, his fist echoing through the quiet house. Olivia appeared moments later, her posture poised but unyielding. Her hand rested protectively on her belly as she opened the door. "Yes, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Harris smirked, holding up an eviction notice. "Ms. Carter, you've failed to meet your obligations. Time's up. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Olivia's eyes flicked to the notice, but her expression remained composed. "I wasn't aware I was behind on anything," she replied. "This is my home." "Well, it's not anymore," Harris shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're being evicted. Pack your things and leave." The small crowd that had begun to gather whispered amongst themselves. A young woman pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the interaction. Olivia glanced at the onlookers, her gaze steady, before turning back to Harris. "This isn't right," she said simply, "and you know it." Harris scoffed, stepping closer. "What I know is that people like you think they can play the system. Not on my watch." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Olivia and Harris. "Maybe we should handle this differently," he murmured to Harris, but his words were ignored. Olivia's expression didn't falter. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone measured. "A mistake you'll regret." Harris sneered. "Is that a threat?" "No," Olivia replied calmly. "It's a fact." With that, she stepped back and closed the door. The small crowd murmured louder now, their curiosity piqued. Harris turned to them, his irritation evident. "Nothing to see here," he barked, but the unease in the air was palpable. Inside her home, Olivia leaned against the door, her hand trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her gaze shifted to a small, unassuming lockbox on the table. She opened it, revealing documents and photos that told a story no one in the neighborhood knew. Dialing a number on her phone, Olivia spoke in a low, calm voice. "It's happening. she said. "Get everything ready." Outside, Harris returned to his patrol car, muttering under his breath about entitled freeloaders. Daniels glanced at him but said nothing. The younger officer's discomfort was growing, but he hadn't yet found the courage to challenge Harris outright. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, one question lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the scene. What was Olivia hiding? And why did she seem so certain that Harris would regret his actions? The answer, they would soon learn, would shake the community to its core. The urban neighborhood bustled with life, though beneath its surface lay the tensions of an unwelcome visitor. Officer Jenkins, with his starched uniform and puffed-up arrogance, approached a modest house that had recently become his focus. The house belonged to Maya, a pregnant black woman who had lived in the community for years. The structure stood resilient, though its peeling paint and slightly overgrown yard made it an easy target for someone like Jenkins, who carried biases like a shield. Jenkins, known for his abrasive demeanor, had convinced himself that Maya didn't belong in this neighborhood. He stalked up the walkway with a clipboard in hand, his boots heavy against the cracked pavement. Behind him trailed Officer Peters, younger and visibly uneasy. Peters glanced nervously at the small crowd forming on the street corner, their murmurs growing as Jenkins stopped at the front door. Maya, sitting calmly inside, watched through the window. She had prepared for this moment. When the knock came, sharp, impatient, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Her presence was dignified, her growing belly unmistakable, as she met Jenkins's sharp gaze. "Ma'am," Jenkins began without introduction, his tone dripping with condescension, "I'm here to enforce this eviction notice. You've failed to comply with zoning regulations. You're officially trespassing on this property." Maya's calm demeanor didn't falter. "Officer Jenkins," she said evenly, "I've complied with every requirement. If there's an issue, it's not from my side." Jenkins smirked, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. "Don't try to play smart with me," he snapped. "This is your final warning. Pack your things, or we'll remove them for you." From across the street, a group of neighbors looked on, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Among them, a young man whispered to a woman, "She's not going to take this lying down. I've heard she's got some serious connections." Back on the porch, Maya stepped out, her poise never wavering. She stood tall, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "Officer Jenkins," she said firmly, "you're overstepping your authority. I know my rights, and I know you have no grounds to evict me." Jenkins laughed mockingly. "Rights? Ma'am, the law's on my side. Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we need to do this the hard way?" The tension escalated as Maya met his taunt with unflinching resolve. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Mark my words." Behind Jenkins, Peter shuffled awkwardly. "Sir, maybe we should double-check the paperwork," he suggested hesitantly. Jenkins shot him a glare that could freeze fire. "Do your job, Peters," he barked. Turning back to Maya, he sneered, "I'm not here to negotiate." Peters hesitated but began reluctantly walking toward the house. Maya moved to block his path. "You don't want to do this," she said, her tone calm but commanding. Peters froze, glancing at Jenkins. The small crowd murmured louder, their unease turning to vocal disapproval. "You can't do this!" someone shouted. A young woman raised her phone to record the unfolding scene. Jenkins, noticing the cameras, turned red with anger. "Disperse, all of you!" he barked at the onlookers. But they didn't budge. The spectacle had gripped their attention. Maya, undeterred by the chaos, pulled out her phone and made a call. Her voice was calm but firm. "Yes, it's time," she said, hanging up after a brief exchange. Her cryptic words sent ripples through the crowd, who began speculating. "Who did she call?" one neighbor whispered. "She doesn't seem scared at all," said another. Minutes later, the sleek hum of a black luxury car interrupted the tension. It pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Marcus, a tall, impeccably dressed man with an air of authority that silenced the crowd's chatter. His tailored suit and polished demeanor exuded power. Jenkins's brow furrowed as Marcus approached. "And who are you supposed to be?" Jenkins sneered. Marcus met his hostility with calm disdain. "I'm here on behalf of Maya," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Officer, you've made a grave mistake." Jenkins laughed bitterly. "Mistake? The only mistake here is her thinking she's above the law." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're not enforcing the law, officer. You're abusing your power. And you're about to face the consequences." The crowd buzzed with whispers. "Who is this guy?" a bystander asked. Maya stepped off the porch, standing beside Marcus. Her confidence was unwavering. "Officer Jenkins," she said, "this is your last chance to back down." Jenkins, now visibly irate, puffed out his chest. "You can't intimidate me. I'm doing my job." Marcus smiled faintly. "We'll see about that." As if on cue, another car arrived. This time, it bore government plates. Two officials stepped out, their suits crisp and their expressions serious. They walked directly toward Jenkins, one of them holding a file. "Officer Jenkins," the taller official began, "we're here to inform you that your actions today are under review. Effective immediately, you are to cease all activities on this property." Jenkins' face drained of color. "What? On what grounds?" he stammered. The official opened the file, revealing documents Jenkins had hoped would never surface. "Your repeated misuse of authority has been documented, officer, and as of now, you are suspended pending investigation." The crowd erupted into cheers. The young woman with the phone grinned as she continued recording. "Justice!" she exclaimed. Jenkins turned to Peters, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you warn me about this?" Peters shrugged helplessly. "I tried, sir." Maya stepped forward, her gaze steady. "You see, Officer Jenkins, you underestimated me. You assumed I was powerless. That was your first mistake." Jenkins opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. The officials escorted him to his car, their stern faces leaving no room for argument. As the scene unfolded, the crowd's murmurs grew. "Who is she?" one neighbor asked. "How does she have this kind of pull?" Maya turned back to Marcus, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Marcus nodded. "This isn't over, but it's a start." The crowd began to disperse, their curiosity far from satisfied. They would soon learn the truth. Maya wasn't just a pregnant woman fighting for her home. She was the heir to a substantial fortune, a philanthropist whose quiet generosity had changed countless lives. The house Jenkins had tried to evict her from wasn't just her residence. It was the centerpiece of a community initiative to provide affordable housing. The ripple effects of Jenkins's actions were far-reaching. By the end of the week, news outlets had picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with hashtags calling for accountability. Maya's calm defiance became a symbol of resistance against injustice, and her story inspired countless others to stand their ground. For Jenkins, the fallout was severe. His suspension turned into a termination, and the department faced mounting pressure to address systemic bias within its ranks. For Maya, The ordeal was a painful reminder of the challenges she still faced, but it also reaffirmed her strength and resilience. And, for the community, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that power, when unchecked, could be challenged and overcome by those who refused to back down. The aftermath of the eviction attempt rippled through the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Whispers about Maya's secret ally, her composure under pressure, and Officer Jenkins's spectacular downfall spread quickly. The street once filled with quiet indifference now buzzed with a sense of vindication. However, for Maya, the ordeal was far from over. She knew the fight wasn't just about her home. It was about the larger injustices that many like her faced every day. 2 days after the confrontation, Maya stood in her small kitchen, brewing a cup of herbal tea. Her movements were deliberate, though her mind raced with plans and contingencies. The confrontation with Jenkins had shaken her, but she knew this was only the beginning. The media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were already leaving messages on her phone, eager for interviews. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Marcus standing there, his expression serious yet supportive. "Maya," he began, stepping inside, "we need to talk about the next steps. Jenkins's suspension is a good start, but there's a larger fight ahead." Maya nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's not just about me anymore. The system allowed this to happen. Jenkins is just a symptom." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You're absolutely right, and the world is watching now. This is the moment to shine a light on everything that's wrong with how people in power abuse their positions." Maya's gaze hardened. "Then let's make it count. But we need a plan." Over the next hour, the two of them strategized. They decided to hold a press conference to share Maya's story, not just the harassment she faced, but the broader implications for others in her situation. They also planned to meet with community leaders to push for systemic changes, including police reform and protections for tenants. By the end of their meeting, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This isn't just about fighting back," she said. "It's about building something better." The press conference was held 2 days later in front of the modest house that had become a symbol of resilience. Reporters crowded the street, their cameras flashing as Maya stepped up to the makeshift podium. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair neatly tied back. Beside her stood Marcus, and behind her, a diverse group of neighbors who had come to show their support. Maya's voice was steady as she addressed the crowd. "What happened to me is not unique," she began. "Every day, people are targeted, harassed, and displaced because of systemic biases and abuses of power. But we're here to say, enough is enough." Her words resonated deeply. She shared details of her confrontation with Jenkins, her family's history in the community, and the broader mission of the affordable housing initiative she'd founded. "This house," she said, gesturing behind her, "is not just a home. It's a promise that everyone deserves a safe place to live, free from fear and harassment." The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping, but Maya maintained her composure. She fielded their inquiries with grace, deflecting any attempts to sensationalize her story. Instead, she kept the focus on the systemic issues at hand. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the precinct, Jenkins sat at his desk, fuming. His suspension had been humiliating enough, but the public outcry had turned him into a pariah. Colleagues avoided him, their once friendly banter replaced by awkward silences. The department had launched an internal investigation, and Jenkins knew his career hung by a thread. As he scrolled through news articles about the incident, his anger grew. The headlines were damning. Pregnant woman stands up to racist cop. Eviction attempt sparks community uprising. And Maya's mission, fighting injustice, one home at a time. She's milking this for all it's worth, Jenkins muttered to himself. But deep down, a small voice nagged at him. Was she, though? Or was she simply holding him accountable for his actions? Officer Peters, who had been largely silent during the ordeal, finally spoke up. "You know, Jenkins," he said cautiously, "maybe it's time to own up to what happened. You crossed a line, and people saw it." Jenkins glared at him. "You're taking her side now?" Peters shook his head. "I'm not taking sides. I'm saying we messed up, and if we don't start owning it, things are only going to get worse." Jenkins didn't respond, but Peters' words lingered. That night, as Jenkins sat alone in his apartment, he replayed the events in his mind. For the first time, he began to see himself through others' eyes, not as an enforcer of the law, but as a bully, abusing his power. Back in the neighborhood, Maya's efforts were gaining momentum. The press conference had sparked a wave of support, with donations pouring in for her affordable housing initiative. Local businesses offered to help with repairs to her house, and volunteers signed up to assist with the community garden she had started years ago. But not everyone was supportive. Anonymous threats began to appear in her mailbox, vague but unsettling messages warning her to back off or face the consequences. Maya reported them to the police, but she refused to be intimidated. "If anything," she told Marcus, "this just proves we're making an impact." One evening, as Maya sat on her porch, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Jenkins. His uniform was gone, replaced by casual clothes that made him look almost ordinary. Maya tensed but held her ground as he stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice hesitant. "I came to apologize." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Apologize," she repeated, her tone skeptical. Jenkins nodded. I was wrong about everything. I let my biases get in the way and I hurt you. I'm sorry." For a moment, Maya said nothing. Then she stood, her gaze piercing. "Do you know what your actions could have done to me? To my child? Your apology doesn't erase that." Jenkins lowered his head. "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to make things right. Tell me how I can help." Maya studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she said, "If you're serious about change, start with yourself. Educate yourself. Volunteer in this community. Show people you're more than your mistakes." Jenkins nodded. "I will," he promised. As he walked away, Maya felt a mix of emotions. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but she knew it was a step toward healing. Not just for her, but for the community as a whole. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The Affordable Housing Initiative expanded, with Maya spearheading efforts to renovate abandoned properties and create safe spaces for families. Jenkins, true to his word, began volunteering at the community center, where he worked quietly alongside the very people he had once dismissed. The story of Maya's resilience and Jenkins's redemption became a symbol of hope. It reminded everyone that while injustice could leave deep scars, it also had the power to ignite change. And for Maya, standing on her porch one quiet evening, the sound of children's laughter filling the air, she knew this was just the beginning. Together, they had proven that even in the face of adversity, a community united by courage and compassion could overcome anything. The silence following Officer Grant's departure was heavy, like the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Despite the officer's exit, the damage he inflicted lingered in the air, a tangible reminder of the indignities many still faced. As Vanessa adjusted her coat and took a deep breath, her hands instinctively moved to cradle her stomach. The life growing within her was the anchor that kept her steady amidst the storm of emotions swirling around her. Inside her modest apartment, Vanessa began to piece together her next steps. She had faced adversity before, and every trial had left her stronger, more resilient. She opened her laptop, determined to document everything. If her voice had been silenced in the heat of the moment, she would ensure it was heard in the aftermath. The email she drafted was precise, recounting every word, every action of the officer, and every witness who had stood silently by. "To whom it may concern," she began, addressing the email to the local precinct and CCing the mayor's office. "I am writing to formally lodge a complaint against Officer Grant. On this date, at this time, he unjustly evicted me from my home. His behavior was discriminatory, unprofessional, and reflective of the systemic issues plaguing our community." Vanessa paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Memories of the officer's smug face and dismissive tone replayed in her mind. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through, recounting the officer's threats, his tone, and his refusal to acknowledge her legal rights as a tenant. Her words flowed like water breaking through a dam, pent-up frustration giving way to clarity and resolve. But Vanessa knew words alone wouldn't suffice. The officer's actions needed to be visible to those in power. She uploaded the video she had recorded to her social media accounts, accompanying it with a brief caption: "This is what justice looks like for some of us." Within minutes, the post began gaining traction. Friends, neighbors, and strangers shared the video, their comments echoing the same outrage and disbelief she had felt. By the following morning, Vanessa's story had gone viral. News outlets picked up the video and reporters began flooding her inbox with requests for interviews. A hashtag emerged: Justice for Vanessa. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but so too were the inevitable criticisms. Anonymous accounts accused her of overreacting, of fabricating details, or of playing the victim. Vanessa refused to be deterred. She agreed to a live interview with a local news station, determined to use the platform to highlight not just her own experience, but the broader issue of systemic discrimination. Sitting in the studio, under the glaring lights, she spoke with poise and conviction. "This isn't just about me," Vanessa said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "It's about every person who has been dismissed, disrespected, or dehumanized because of who they are. It's about demanding accountability from those who are supposed to protect us." Her words struck a chord. The video of her interview spread across social media, amplifying her message. Vanessa's resilience inspired others to come forward with their own stories of injustice. Each testimony added to a growing chorus demanding change. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Grant's behavior had placed the department under intense scrutiny. The captain, a seasoned officer who prided himself on maintaining order, called an emergency meeting. As Grant sat at the conference table, his usual bravado was replaced by a defensive scowl. "This department does not tolerate discrimination," the captain began, his tone stern. "Officer Grant, your actions have brought shame to this precinct, effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation." Grant's face flushed with anger. "With all due respect, Captain, this is being blown out of proportion," he protested. "That woman," the captain raised a hand to silence him. "That woman," he said, his voice icy, "is a citizen with rights, just like anyone else. If you can't uphold those rights, you have no place wearing this badge." The suspension didn't satisfy the public. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their chants echoing through the streets. "Accountability now! Justice for Vanessa! read one of the signs. Community leaders joined the demonstrations, demanding systemic reforms to address the underlying issues that had led to the incident. Vanessa watched the protests from her apartment window, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She was grateful for the support, but she also knew the fight was far from over. She turned her attention to her legal team, a group of dedicated civil rights attorneys who had reached out after seeing her story. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again," said Rebecca, the lead attorney. "Not to you, and not to anyone else." The legal battle that followed was grueling. Grant's defense team argued that his actions were justified, painting Vanessa as confrontational and uncooperative. But the video evidence and testimony from witnesses painted a different picture. In the courtroom, Vanessa's calm demeanor and clear recounting of the events contrasted sharply with Grant's defensive and often contradictory statements. "Officer Grant violated my rights," Vanessa said during her testimony. "But more than that, he violated the trust that we, as a community, place in law enforcement. This case isn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to operate without accountability." Her words resonated with the jury. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Grant was convicted of misconduct and faced both criminal charges and civil penalties. The decision marked a significant victory for Vanessa and her legal team, but its impact extended far beyond the courtroom. The case became a catalyst for change. Local officials announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for law enforcement officers and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. Vanessa was invited to join the board, her voice becoming a crucial part of the conversation around accountability and justice. As she stood before a packed auditorium at a community meeting months later, Vanessa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "This fight isn't just mine," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "It's ours. Together we can build a system that truly serves and protects everyone." The audience erupted into applause, their support a testament to the impact Vanessa had made. Her story, once a personal struggle, had become a beacon of hope and resilience for countless others. And though the road ahead was long, Vanessa knew she wasn't walking it alone. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Monica Johnson, a pregnant black woman with quiet dignity, sat beside her lawyer, Emma Parker. Emma was known for her tenacity, the kind of lawyer who didn't back down from a fight, especially when justice was at stake. Across the room sat Officer Blake, whose smug demeanor had faltered over the course of the trial. This wasn't supposed to happen. In his mind, Monica was just another eviction. A number, a statistic. He never expected the backlash or the revelations that were about to unfold. Emma stood tall as the judge signaled her to proceed. Her calm yet commanding presence filled the room. "Your Honor, this case is about more than an unlawful eviction. It's about the misuse of authority and the consequences of prejudgment." Monica Johnson was wrongfully evicted from her home, not because she violated any law, but because someone assumed she didn't belong. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Monica, sitting quietly, exuded grace despite everything she had endured. The pain of being forced out of her home while pregnant, humiliated in front of her neighbors, and treated as though she were invisible, was etched in her eyes. Yet she held her head high, trusting Emma to fight for her. The events leading to this moment were still fresh in Monica's mind. Officer Blake had arrived at her modest but well-kept apartment with an air of authority that brooked no argument. She had tried to explain, to show a rental agreement and proof of residency, but Blake hadn't cared. "People like you always have excuses," he had sneered. Then, without so much as a second glance at her documents, he'd handed her an eviction notice. "Move out by the end of the day," he'd said coldly. Monica had been stunned, her words caught in her throat. She knew better than to escalate the situation. People like Blake had power that could ruin lives. But as she sat on the curb that evening, surrounded by her belongings, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just her fight, it was bigger than her. And that's when she called Emma Parker. Now, in the courtroom, Emma paced slowly, her tone deliberate. Officer Blake claims he acted within the scope of his duty. But let's examine the facts, shall we? She gestured to the evidence table, where a stack of documents and photographs sat. This is Monica's lease agreement, which was active at the time of her eviction. Here are her rent receipts, paid in full and on time. And here are the emails between Officer Blake and certain neighborhood residents which show a coordinated effort to target tenants based on nothing more than prejudice. The courtroom murmured as Emma held up the emails. In these exchanges, Officer Blake was encouraged to remove undesirables from the area. Monica Johnson, a pregnant woman, became collateral damage in this discriminatory agenda. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the smugness draining from his face. His lawyer whispered frantically to him, but there was little they could say to counter the evidence stacking up against him. The judge leaned forward, her expression grave. "Miss Parker, do you have further evidence to present?" Emma nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to reveal something that Officer Blake might have discovered had he performed even the most basic due diligence." Monica's brow furrowed in confusion. Emma hadn't mentioned this part of the case to her. "Your Honor," Emma continued, "Monica Johnson is not just a tenant. She is the beneficiary of a trust fund left to her by her late father, a successful entrepreneur. She owns multiple properties, investments, and assets that make her one of the wealthiest individuals in this neighborhood." The courtroom erupted into gasps. Blake's face turned a deep shade of red, and his lawyer's mouth fell open. The judge struck her gavel to restore order. "Ms. Parker," the judge said, "are you saying that the defendant evicted a woman of significant means without investigating her claims of residency?" "That is exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor," Emma replied. She turned to Blake, her gaze icy. Officer Blake assumed that Monica Johnson didn't belong. He looked at her, not at her documents, not at the truth. And because of his assumptions, he violated her rights in the most egregious way possible. The audience whispered among themselves. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. One woman muttered, "How could he be so blind?" Another said, "This changes everything." Monica watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and pride. For too long, she had been dismissed, underestimated, and ignored. But today, her story was being told. Emma wasn't done. She addressed the jury directly, her voice steady. This case isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their race, gender, or economic status, is treated as though they are less than. Monica Johnson deserves justice. And by delivering that justice today, you will send a message that no one is above the law. The jury's faces were inscrutable, but the weight of Emma's words was undeniable. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Officer Blake was found guilty of misconduct, and damages were awarded to Monica for the trauma she had endured. But the impact of the trial extended far beyond the courtroom. News outlets picked up the story, and Monica became a symbol of resilience and strength. Emma's fiery defense of her client made headlines, and soon people from all over the country were sharing Monica's story. Blake's career, on the other hand, was over. The department launched an internal investigation into his actions, uncovering a pattern of similar behavior that had gone unchecked for years. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that authority must be wielded responsibly. To everyone watching, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced or witnessed injustice? Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Let's keep this conversation going and work together for a fairer world. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories that remind us of the power of resilience, justice, and hope. Together, we can make a difference.